I will turn it over to our programming chair, Randy Gabrielle, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
The Middletown Township Historical Society is pleased to welcome Glenn Cashion to talk about his new book, Baseball is in My DNA. If the title seems a bit unusual, the premise is not, because baseball is in America's DNA. It is our national pastime, not because of the presence of overpaid, delicate major league players, because baseball was played throughout the country as our recreational culture evolved in every town by all peoples. And Glenn is going to tell us about his experience, his family's experience, and baseball in Freehold. Glenn was educated at Brown University. He's had a successful career in the telecommunications industry. And now in the historical realm, he serves on the Monmouth County Historical Commission with me and Society trustee Peter Van Nortwick. And he is a trustee of the Monmouth County Historical Association, where I'm pleased to say he is a defender of their most precious object, the Loitzy painting, Washington rallying the troops. The book is for sale here tonight. It's a great book. I've read it and enjoyed it, and you will too. Glenn?
Thank you, Randy, for those kind words. And thank you, Tom, and the other members of the Middletown Township Historical Society for allowing me to speak a little bit tonight about my favorite subject, baseball. You know, my book is about Freehold baseball and my family. However, I believe the storyline, as Randy indicated, was repeated many, many places throughout America, and particularly in Monmouth County. I, like many of you, grew up thinking that one summer afternoon in Cooperstown in 1839, local boys were playing a game of town ball with no clear rules established. Abner Doubleday allegedly set down rules for this town ball and invented baseball. I was led to believe that for many years. A.G. Spaulding popularized this tale with a guy named Henry Chadwick doubting that premise and offering an opposing view that it was an evolutionary process and not a mere invention. Doubleday was, in fact, not even around Cooperstown at that time. He was in West Point and never carried anything about baseball. The game of baseball, as we know it today, has evolved. It was not invented. Baseball has rudiments of both cricket, a game that has innings and an umpire associated with it, and a childhood stick and ball game called rounders, which had went by various names throughout the northeast coast, particularly New England and mid-Atlantic states. And it went by names of Old Cat, New Cat, Two Cat, Gold Ball, Town Ball, Stick Ball, Round Ball, and eventually Baseball with two words. It didn't become baseball with one word until many years thereafter. Baseball was known in the 18th century. A guy named Colonel Joseph Lee, elected member of the Knickerbocker Club of New York, in 1846 said that he had often played the game when a boy, and by that time he was in his mid-60s. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes said he remembered baseball during his college days at Harvard, and Dr. Holmes graduated in 1829. Princeton University banned ball playing in 1787 as a low and unbecoming gentleman sport. The first set of baseball rules was drawn up by Alexander Joy Cartwright and a guy named Doc Adams, and adopted by this Knickerbocker Club in 1845. This set of rules eliminated being called out by being hit by a thrown ball, which is the way it started. It established the new rules of 1 hands, 3 out, where previously batters, or strikers as they were called, batted around the whole team before they actually changed sides. That was eliminated with the idea of 3 outs. They also called match game instead of a ball game. Striker, as I already indicated, fly catcher behind. The scorer was a very important position and noted in scorecards and box scores for many, many decades. So by the first game under these rules established in 1845 was a game at Hoboken on June 19th, 1846. The baseball fields of New York were overcrowded, so they took ferries to Hoboken in order to continue and expand their ball playing. Now, two other figures of baseball history are worthy of a quick note. Henry Chadwick was known as the father of baseball. Chadwick was a reporter and was instrumental in having the New York Times and other dailies publish baseball statistics. He introduced the baseball box score. And another player turned author during this time was John Montgomery Ward. Montgomery Ward, no relation to the other Montgomery Ward, but he was a very knowledgeable baseball fan. And this book is actually, it's not the original, but he wrote it in 1888. Chadwick's Compendium of Baseball, which contained the rules of the Knickerbocker 1845 rules, was written in 1860. Montgomery Ward's book, 1888, was the first one that actually defined the various positions in depth. This is 1888. So it defined first base, second baseman, third baseman, et cetera. And it also defined, which is kind of interesting, things in terms like the brushback. Now, this is in 1888, and they were pitching, remember, in those days underhand and from 55 feet, but they still used brushbacks. He discussed the hit and run without naming it. He discussed the pickoff play. He affirmed that bases are stolen by the pitcher, not the catcher. And he treats the subject of whether a curveball curves as a settled matter. It really is an interesting book. And just as an aside, it was just a couple of nights on Jeopardy, a question came up regarding an individual by the name of Candy Cummings. Candy Cummings was the guy credited with the first curveball in 1867. Some people say 1869, but the point is that it was debated whether it was a real fact or an optical, as he calls it, optical delusion. And he justifies it technically with physics in this little book that a curveball really was a curveball. But let's get a little closer to home. The Elysian Fields of Hoboken was not the only baseball field in New Jersey. In fact, in 1860, when Newark was the 11th largest city in the United States, interestingly enough. And by that time, New Jersey had 177 ball clubs, 177, and 21 in 21 municipalities. And Newark had 52 clubs alone. That's just amazing. You know, another interesting tidbit I'll mention before I get into Freehold. Throwing underhand and having umpires not call balls and strikes led to long times at bat. So was not unusual for the batter, striker as it's called, to be given these slow pitches until he actually decided which one to hit. Batters in those days actually came to the plate and called the pitcher where to throw the ball. And if he didn't get that position, that ball thrown in that place, he just waited. And it wasn't unusual for a batter to have 40 to 60 pitches thrown at him. In fact, there's a statistic of 1860 where teams called the Atlantics and the Excelsiors, two opposing pitchers tossed a total of 665 pitches in 3 innings. All right. So, you know, it was a long drawn out game. And likewise, the games, because it was underhand and because you could wait until you got your pitch and the fielders weren't that adept, they weren't wearing gloves, scores were astronomical. They were more like football scores than anything else. Okay. So now let's get closer to home. The clarion call for baseball in Freehold came from an 1857 newspaper article in the local paper. A well-organized baseball or cricket club would be a capital thing and likely save several doctor's bills besides. Similar clubs live and flourish in other villages. Have we not the spirit enough to get up one here? What say the clerks and the boys? Where are the Freehold athletes? So that clarion call took a little while, not too long, because the next year there were indeed 20 members of the Freehold Baseball Club, baseball being 2 words. While there's no record of the team's performance during that year, the team started with a solid moral code. Quote, any member using vulgar or profane language upon the ground shall be fined a sum not over $1 and suspended from playing until the game comes to an end. Interesting. One of the earliest box scores from that time frame is this particular one, dated 1866, with the Athletics and the Institutes playing. Notice the scorer is named William Hageman. The fly catchers, which are those who caught flies, are listed. And the score in this particular game was 30-17. The Monmouth Baseball Club was formed in 1872 with 75 honorary members. And with the Monmouth Baseball Club organization, Freehold boasted 6 baseball clubs. This is in 1872. The Andes, the Atlantics, the Dolly Vardens, the Independents, the Natahalas, and the Monmouth team. In June, the Monmouth Club met the Natahala team and soundly defeated them 40-8. On the pole flew the national colors, which are depicted here. Some mounted by the pennant of the club, a white streamer bound with a blue bearing a large M. Now, throughout the, I guess I should go that way. Throughout the history of Freehold, baseball teams had many names. Most of the time, they were very common names. Freehold Baseball Club, Cubs, Athletics, et cetera, et cetera. However, there were a few quirky names that came into effect. A short-lived baseball team was the Dolly Vardens, shown here on the right. Now, the Dolly Vardens had a character. The character comes from a Charles Dickens book in Barnaby Rudge, one of the only 2 historical novels he wrote. And why it was called the Dolly Vardens of Freehold is beyond me. No idea. It had the name Dolly Vardens actually has always been a symbol of feisty endurance, and perhaps that's why they picked it. On the left, you have a team called the Modocs. Now, the Modoc is another quirky, strange name. Modoc does not seem to have any relevance to Freehold. The Modoc Indian tribe in 1872 was located in Northern California. Some disputes arose and war broke out between the Modoc tribe and the United States government. It was only the major Indian war fought in California, and the only one there in which an army general was killed. The war lasted from November 72 to June of 73. The Modoc team was established shortly after the Modoc War, perhaps in sympathy with the Modoc tribe, but who knows? But they were kind of unique. Now, another unique ball club was the Natahala team. I mentioned them a few minutes ago. Now, Natahala this is the oldest known photograph of a Freehold baseball team. They were part of the Freehold Institute. Natahala is a Cherokee name, not of New Jersey Indian heritage. The Natahalas were an excellent ball club, winning local championships in 1873, 1874, and 76. And in 1873, they actually beat the Modocs by a score of 43-33. Now, the Freehold Institute Ball Club, it played the reorganized Monmouth team in 1886 as sort of an old-timers game, as the Monmouth team had been reestablished after they first formed back in 1872. They went away, they came back again and reorganized, which is a common theme in Freehold baseball and baseball in many places. So the quote for this particular game from the local newspapers: "Much interest was excelled in the match, and many fair ones assembled to see their fathers, husbands, and lovers participate in the game. Freeman caught 3 elegant foul flies behind the bat, which made his heart swell with pride. Conover appeared in his knobby knickerbockers and was prepared to mash the field. He did some elegant pitching. Bennett distinguished himself by endeavoring to make a home run on called balls, but died a natural death at third base. Davis swayed a fly, but excitement caused him to pull the filling out of his cigar, which made him ill. And the Institute boys ended up winning 47-12. An idea of the illustrative language used in the sports writers' world in those days. Now, note that there were 17 teams who played ball in Freehold between 1858 and 1900. And from 1900 to 1973, there were an additional 45 identified teams who played ball in the Freehold Diamonds. I'll get to Tony McNicholas and E.I. Vanderveer in a few moments. However, let me bring my family into this baseball story. In 1887, a short-lived team called the Orientals was organized. The catcher on that team was Jim Fitzgibbons, my great uncle. Jim, like most baseball players over the years, would play on several different Freehold teams, and he moved to Red Bank in the early 1900s. This photo actually is when he was with the Red Bank Alerts in circa 1903. He also became involved in county baseball while he was in Red Bank, both playing and finally getting involved in the baseball hierarchy. And he was a plumber by trade, and he ended up moving to Point Pleasant eventually, and that's where he ended his life. This is a photo of the Monmouth Baseball Club with William Wesley Crawford in the back row, third from right. Distinguished looking gentleman up there. Crawford will feature in an interesting story in a few moments. We believe this photo was taken in Spring Lake. If you notice in the bottom, it's Freehold versus Spring Lake. All right. Freehold and Red Bank were and continue to be hot baseball rivals up through the time I was playing in the 1950s and 60s. In 1887, let me go back to that team, because in 1887, the Monmouth team was pitted against the Red Bank Eurekas. According to the local newspaper, the crowd assembled seemed to applaud whenever they made a good play and to hiss the umpire, a guy named Mr. Tom Arrowsmith from Freehold. And the Monmouths, whenever a point was scored, a run was scored against them. This went on until it became disgraceful. When the Monmouths ran up the score in the third inning to 9, one man in the crowd began throwing apples and sticks at the umpire. And another cried, "Mob him." And the crowd rushed towards him. Mr. Arrowsmith's father happened to be standing in the crowd, and when he saw the mob starting for his son, he drew a revolver and said, "The first one who touches him gets shot." Well, at this time, the crowd began to scatter, and no blows were struck. The umpire called the game, and everybody went home. But an idea of the kind of bitter team play that took place in those days. Now, in 1891, another reorganization, another team was created, one of the 17 in this time frame. It was created by a local butcher from Freehold. He decided to organize a team. He brought in 2 of his friends, and they sat around the table and decided what would he call the team. 3 different names were given by the 3 organizers, all claiming it was the right one. The 3 options were the Keg Drainers, the Freehold Temperance Baseball Club, 2 opposite extremes perhaps, and the Wild Ducks, and the latter name was chosen. Now, why the Wild Ducks? I have the faintest idea. The Wild Ducks and the Monmouths played a good ball game in 1891, revealing the rather casual approach to baseball playing in those days. This gets to our friend Wes Crawford. The Monmouth lineup remained pretty much the same as that previous match, except for one substitution. Wes Crawford took the place of Harry Thompson in left field for 2 innings, while Harry went downtown Freehold and sold a sewing machine. He was a salesman for Singer Sewing Machine. Thompson's priorities always seemed to be sewing machines and not so much on the baseball team. Here are a couple of other examples of old-time baseball teams. This one on the left is 1897, the Veterans versus the Son of Rest. E.I. Vanderveer is seated in the second row on the far right in this photograph. The other 1904, E.I. and under the yellow arrow is the center manager. Going a little bit more detail on E.I. But at the start of the 20th century, local businesses started to field teams. The V.H. Rothschild Shirt Factory, organized by my uncle, not the shirt factory, the team, by Edward Cashion, had a formidable team. The Stokes Brothers File Factory and the American Steam Laundry Companies, also in Freehold, also fielded teams. And moving into the vacated site of that shirt factory in 1904 was A&M Karagushin, which became the rug mill by name, and for 60 years would be the major employer in Freehold, and at its peak employing nearly 1,700 people. Their sponsored team would dominate later in the century. Now, from 1891 to 1903, my grandfather's brother, Tony McNicholas, was the Freehold pitching and batting star. During the last half of 1893, the Monmouths had a robust schedule. They had a long winning streak against Mineola, Brooklyn, Union of New York, the Police Gazette of New York, Spring Lake, Montgomery of Jersey City, the Wild Ducks, and the Shirt Factory. Tony McNicholas was the dominant pitcher throughout this period, averaging 10 strikeouts per game. One of the 1893 games is quite significant. Per local reporting, quote, "The Princeton Giants came to Freehold, a 9 of colored waiters from the hotels of Princeton. The game was one of the best ever played in Freehold. McNicholas pitched a strong game, striking out 15 men. McNicholas contributed with 2 hits, a double and driving in a run in the 8th inning. In the end, the Giants prevailed 9-6. This was the first recorded game of a black baseball team to play on the Freehold Diamond. During the 1905 to 1921 timeframe, black baseball teams started to emerge on their own in Freehold, not necessarily only visiting teams. The Cashion name started to appear in baseball box scores and will continue to occupy prominence in baseball articles until 1973. This photo has my father on the second row catching with a catcher's mitt, my uncle Edward in the rear. I mentioned him earlier as a manager of one of the teams. And my other uncle Bill on the far left. Now, Bill, he played some ball, but elected to go into the restaurant business and owned the Colts Neck Inn for several decades. Baseball teams came into existence, reorganized, and became the town's recreational highlight. And yes, baseball was allowed to be played on Sunday. One tidbit about the Cashion, Edward Cashion, managed team. My brother, David Cashion, once related that his uncle had one problem during his managing days. The problem was a pitcher, a good one. According to Dim, my uncle and father would have to lock him up in his room at night to keep him sober for the next day's game. Problem in those days. Now, during 1904 and 1905, Edward Cashion moved from manager to secretary of a team called the Freehold Seniors. Seniors had a very, for all things considered during this time frame, a long tenure for several years. In this role, Ed was responsible for scheduling a 50-game schedule. On Decoration Day in 1905, they played a doubleheader, beating Princeton on their Freehold field in the morning and beating Long Branch in the afternoon. They played baseball morning, noon, and night. Black baseball teams played against white teams for decades in Freehold, starting with the first call for black players in 1905. There were 7 black teams who played on Freehold Diamonds from 05 to 1944. The Excelsiors were playing outstanding ball from 1916 to 22. The 40AC team was in the league associated with the Firemen. Other teams were the Grays, the Eagles, etc. A total of 7. It was an era where there was obviously not the blacks hadn't integrated yet. I'll talk about the first one in a second in Freehold, but they were diligently, with no problem, playing against each other, team by team, on the Freehold Diamonds for several decades. Black barnstorming teams were very common during this era. This is a picture of the Brooklyn Royal Giants. It's dated 1916, but throughout the period I mentioned, several black teams played in Freehold. The Giants actually played in Freehold in 1905. The New York Black Sox, founded by boxer Jack Johnson, played in 1910 in Freehold, and the Philadelphia Colored Giants played 1910, 24, and 34. They were quite dominant in their own right. They traveled all over the East Coast, and they were a very, very good team. Okay, now another member of the family who was involved in baseball, but not on the diamond, was my grandmother. Sunday baseball was not legal in early days. Local newspapers urged, quote, that measures be taken to stop the evil. This is another Sunday nuisance. In 1889, laws were proposed to make Sunday baseball a misdemeanor. Churches also opposed Sunday baseball. Well, in 1921, E.I. Vanderveer, that fellow whose picture appeared a couple times earlier, and played and involved in Freehold baseball for generations. He spearheaded a drive for Sunday baseball. Affidavits stating that Sunday games were orderly and that the only noise was caused by hand clapping, which only lasted a few minutes. The affidavits were submitted by 3 individuals, one of whom was my grandmother, Mrs. Jenny McNicholas, who lived a half a block away from the local field at Lincoln Place, and a house that the family actually lived in until the 1960s. So the 1920s and 30s were amazing times in Freehold baseball. E.I. Vanderveer followed my uncle Edward Cashion as the head of the manager of the Freehold teams, and he did that for from 1904 to 1938. His Freehold teams won championships in 1916, 22, 23, and 25. His teams were dominant in Monmouth County, and attendance soared. Here's a headline. Monmouth baseball team wins, and this is 1923 with over 1,000 fans, but there are other instances where they drew 1,500 fans. Remember that the population of Freehold, by the way, at that time was about 3,000. So, half the population was at a game. E.I. Vanderveer was clearly the best manager in Monmouth County during this period. He had fantastic ball players. And he once remarked that he'll never forget when Bill Rhodes, one of his key players, knocked a homer off of Satchel Paige. He is shown in the previous 1887 photo, I mentioned that. Among his many talents was his championship shooting. One of the fondest memories was when he topped the famous Andy Oakley in 1916. He's quite a guy. And he was still involved in baseball when I was playing in Babe Ruth League baseball in 1954. He was the commissioner of the league, and he died the following year. And this is a photo of his 1922 championship team. The gentleman in the upper right is my father, David Demers Cashion, the fellow who was the catcher from 1904 to 1919. But in 1920, he became an umpire, and E.I. Vanderveer called my father, Dim, his umpire. So whenever a team shot was made, a photo was made, Dim, my father, was always in the photo. Now, when he hung up his catcher's glove and became that umpire, he became quite a good umpire. He was a gregarious guy, apparently. He died when I was 6 months old, so I never knew him, unfortunately. But he became quite an adept umpire and loved by all. And by 1926, he reached a plateau of umpiring excellence, and the Jersey Shore Umpires Organization asked him to umpire the game of his life. On October 10th, 1926, the New York Yankees lost the World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals in a hotly contested 7-game series, with Babe Ruth being thrown out at second base trying to steal. Babe Ruth embarked the next day on a whirlwind barnstorming tour, including 9 cities in 16 days. The very next day, October 11th, 1926, Babe Ruth's team held their first exhibition game in Bradley Beach against the Royal Giants of Brooklyn, that team I referenced a few minutes ago. The game drew the largest crowd that had ever attended a game at the Bradley Beach field. Local newspapers and the New York Times reporting that the size of the crowd at 3,500 to 5,000. Babe's first appearance at the bat resulted in a soft grounder to the pitcher for an easy out. At his next appearance at the plate, Babe watched a couple of wild pitches go by and also fouled off 2 pitches. He then watched a pitch be called a strike, and my father called him out. The local newspapers reported that, quote, Cashion behind the home plate umpired the game in a creditable manner, unquote. Many years later, in 1938, Cashion stopped by the Freehold courthouse to chat with some old friends. A local attorney brought up the 1926 game. Cashion responded to the attorney's comment by saying that Babe had turned around slowly and remarked, "Well, I guess you're right." And he casually walked away. This photo of my father umping behind home plate, unfortunately, it's not Babe Ruth. But this is a picture that was sitting in my mother's dresser for years and years, and we never talked about it. I never got to the true story about this until I started doing my research. And likewise, I've searched high and low for additional photographs. You would think, and I know that there are photographers there at that game, but I have yet to find any other photographs. If anybody has one, please let me know. So as I earlier indicated, Freehold boasted 50+ teams from the early 50s, early 1900s through the early 70s. However, the Freehold Firemen team stands out as among them all, best of them all. The team was in operation for 16 years and won 5 Fireman League championships and 2 Monmouth County championships. Throughout its championship runs, the team was managed by an individual named Joe Crotchfeld. And old reliable E.I. Vanderveer did pick up the reins of being manager at the end of the tour in 1938. There were huge turnouts for this team. The team played during this time frame, the inner field of the Freehold racetrack. Imagine that, in the inner field, they created a baseball field. And crowds in the range of 1,500 to 1,800 attended those games. One of the pitching stars of the team was an individual named Fred Quinn, later to become mayor of Freehold, who pitched a perfect game in 1936. As far as I could tell, we've only had 2 perfect games pitched in Freehold during this entire time frame. And this trophy is one of the trophies from his reign. This is a 1931 trophy, several of which are sitting in the Freehold Firehouse. And this is a picture of the team, with E.I. managing in the center again with his famous mustache. So this follows the run of Joe Crotchfeld, but it is a 1938 Freehold Fireman team. Now, a player who wasn't originally from Freehold is depicted in this photo. His family moved to Freehold in the mid-1930s, over on South Street in Freehold. House is still there. Frankie Hayes, originally from Jamesburg, he played on E.I. Vanderveer's team in the 1933 timeframe and quickly found himself with the Philadelphia Athletics the year later, 1934. In 1935, at the end of the athletic season, he did come back to play a game in Freehold, and he caught my brother, Dim, in a game in Freehold. Hayes was a 6-time All-Star and holds the Major League record for consecutive games by a catcher, 312. He was the Cleveland Indians catcher in 1946 when Bob Feller pitched his no-hitter, and Frankie at the bottom of the 9th inning hit a game-winning home run. Now, in 1934, the true nature of this interesting story is as follows. In 1934, Connie Mack established a barnstorming team that went to Japan. Now, on that team were Jimmy Fox, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and several others. He brought in 2 catchers. One was a catcher who had worked with him in Philadelphia, but he became ill at the end and he couldn't make the trip. So he needed another second catcher. They had one catcher named Mo Berg, right? And another catcher became Frankie Hayes. So Frankie went over to Japan with this team of Connie Macks. Now, while the catching duties were to have alternated between Berg and Hayes, that arrangement didn't materialize. Berg caught the first game and a couple more, but most of the games were caught by Frankie Hayes. On November 29th, 1934, the American team pounded the Japanese team 23-5, and Berg was not at the game. He had allegedly left to visit a friend at St. Luke's Hospital in downtown Tokyo. The hospital was a 7-story structure, unusually tall in Tokyo. And when Berg arrived at the hospital, he donned a kimono and proceeded to the roof, where there was a panoramic view of Tokyo. And from beneath his kimono, Berg took out a movie camera. And for 4 hours, he nervously recorded the surroundings of the city, including shipyards, industrial complexes, and military installations. After the filming, he hid the camera back under his kimono and went back to the game. Approximately 7.5 years later, Berg turned the film over to the FBI and military intelligence. And that film was among the photographs used in the April 18th, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the Japanese mainland. Mo Berg was an amazing guy. He was a Princeton and Columbia Law School alum, a linguist with fluency in, some people say, approximately 17 languages. And he was a member of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. He was a spy, and he served the United States Intelligence Services for many years. There is Mo with his camera. Interesting story. And back on that shot of Tokyo, Mo is on the left under the yellow arrow. If you can see, he actually signed his name in Japanese also. Frankie Hayes is under the red arrow, and of course Babe Ruth under the blue arrow next to Connie Mack. This is a photo of the National Lead Team who won the Industrial Championship of Mercer County in 1937. My brother Dim is in the center. He's in the top row, third from the left. And Dim started playing ball with the American Legion team in 1933. Dim was born in 1928. He played ball from 33, then he joined this team, won the championship in 37, and will continue to play until my book ends in 1973. Noteworthy in this photo is the player in the second row, center, two to the left of my brother. His name is Hank Skank, an African-American. He played besides Dim on this team. In addition, they both played following this on the Freehold Holy Name team. Then they both played on the first Freehold Golston team in 1938, winning the championship of the Jersey Shore League in 1938. Hank was the first black ball player to play on a white team in Freehold. Hank's love of baseball his love of baseball continued for many, many years. Hank was the umpire when I was in Little League and Babe Ruth League. He was still very involved, still living in the same house that his daughter lives in today on Hull Avenue in Freehold. His love of the game was even in evidence at the birth of his daughter. The delivery was at the hospital in downtown Freehold. They couldn't get the Fitkin, as it was known then, hospital, and there was a hospital in Freehold on Main Street. Hank was present during the delivery, and when he saw his new daughter, he stood tall and proud in his baseball uniform. So, he was a baseball man forever. And his daughter's, one daughter still lives in that house, and it was really a remarkable story to find out his involvement with my brother. All right, well, baseball, there's Hank in his Holy Name uniform. That's actually his house on Hull Avenue he's standing in front of. Well, baseball in Freehold in the 1940s and 50s continued to dominate. Even during the war years, there was always some baseball being played. Prior to the war, there were numerous teams playing. There was a newspaper article in 1939 in the local Freehold transcript. The headline of the sports page had at least 6 different Freehold teams with their box scores. When the boys came home from the war, most of the baseball energy centered around the reorganized Golstons, with Glenn Cashion leading the team. One of the fascinating teams to watch. Oops. We got a little. This is another team in Freehold at that time, just a point of interest, called the Freehold Cosmos. Like many, this was a team that was quickly organized. It was organized at a grocery store in what was called Texas, down near the rug mill in Freehold. A guy named Bill Goldstein decided to form a team, and this became the Freehold Cosmos. All right, this is the summary of the black teams, which I did go through with that already. Now, one of the one of the interesting teams that used to occasionally come through Monmouth County and played in Freehold numerous times was the House of David team. When they came, everybody came out. They were a very exciting team. The Bearded Group, known as the House of David, which was a religious sect, not a Jewish sect, a religious sect from Michigan, founded way back in 1903. They brought baseball antics to the baseball diamond. They were credited with inventing, actually, aside from that, the automatic pin setter in bowling alleys. But more germane to baseball, they're credited with creating the idea of pepper games. If you're familiar with a pepper game in baseball, which many people aren't these days, but that way, and they were a jovial team. They played baseball with antics, but with skill. One of the pitchers actually was from Freehold, a guy named Ed Juresco. And my brother said that Jimmy Woods, who was a House of David's player, was the best first baseman he had ever seen. Jim said Woods couldn't hit the side of a barn, but he was to first base what Goose Tatum was to basketball. And I heard other individuals remark the same way. This team is the 1938 Golstons. The elected to show that team on my head of my book, my cover of my book. I think it speaks to the enthusiasm that is shown in their faces. It shows my brother in the center, second row. It shows Hank Skank on the left. So it captures a lot of what baseball is about in Freehold, with my family and with now the integration, slow integration that it was. Hank was the only black player for many years, but at least it was integration in Freehold. Let's see here. Dim, my brother, loved and breathed baseball. Following in our father's path, which was, the father was the catcher before he was the umpire. And while E.I. Vanderveer was called the grandfather of Freehold baseball, Dim was indeed the father of Freehold baseball. He pitched a no-hitter in 1938, playing for the Freehold Firemen. And my father was the umpire behind the plate, which shouldn't detract from his no-hitter. Dim played for numerous teams. Everyone wanted him on the team. In addition to playing for several teams in Freehold, he played for the Red Bank Pirates, the Belmar Braves, Englishtown Sporting Club, and the Brooklyn Bushwicks. Dim was under contract with the Washington Senators in 1940 and played with the Salisbury, Maryland minor league team in the Eastern Shore League. And in 1949, he played with the Washington Senators team in Kingston, New York. Following the war, the Freehold teams were becoming somewhat consolidated. And of particular note is that reorganized Freehold Golston team. This go back to, this is the 38 team. They played for a couple of years. War intervened. Boys went off to war, came back. Many of the teams disbanded, and they created a very formidable Freehold Golston team sponsored by the Rug Mill in 1946. Now, when they came back, you can tell by their disassembled uniform structure here, there's nothing consistent there. Some of them have only names, some have Golston, some have other individual. They didn't have any money to support the team. The team was founded on $100, and that only bought stockings for the players. The nice Golston jersey pictured on the left came the next year. The 1946 team narrowly lost the 46 Jersey Shore championships to the Red Bank Tanners, but they would avenge that loss in the future. The 47 Golstons won the Jersey Shore championship by beating Asbury Park before 1,000 spectators in Freehold. And during the season, Dim struck out 16 on July and 17 in August. He led the team to a win with 2 home runs and a 3-2 victory over the Tanners. Another mainstay batter for the Golstons was Swede Hansen. Swede Hansen is very well known in this area as both a football star in the 30s as well as a baseball player. The 1948 Golstons beat Red Bank in a 3-game series to again win the Jersey Shore championship. So here's Dim on the left hitting a home run in 1946. The pitcher on the right is a guy named Bill Tiela, who was an outstanding pitcher for Freehold. And here's the headline where they came back from 7th place to win the 48 championship. Frankie Hayes, go back to Frankie again. Now that the family had moved to Freehold in the mid-30s, his younger brother, Bobby, went to Freehold High School and was a catcher for a pitcher by the name of Ralph Steinberg. Here is Frankie shaking hands with his younger brother in 48. Now, while the Golstons were winning championships, Ralph was pitching no-hitters for Freehold High. In April 1948, he pitched back-to-back no-hitters and barely missed a third due to a leadoff single. Both Bobby Hayes and Ralph spent time in the minor leagues. Ralph joined the new team organized by my brother, the Freehold Merchants, which followed the Golstons, and narrowly missed another no-hitter in 1950, in which he struck out 16 Leonardo players. In July 1951, again against Leonardo, Ralph struck out 19 batters. 3 days later, he beat Belmar and struck out 22, and that's the game that's depicted here. He was quite a pitcher. Ralph did sign a contract with the Chicago Cubs. However, he did not stay with the Cubs and moved to the legal profession and became a distinguished judge in Florida. Judge Steinberg of the Hillsborough Circuit Court sentenced Darrell Strawberry to an 18-month prison term for violating his court-ordered parole. This is sort of a summary of evolution into the 70s with the Golstons moving into a team called the Merchants, the Townsmen, Farm Belt League started, which was a precursor to the Freehold Little League. And it mentions again the 45 baseball teams. This picture is of the Cashion clan, taken in 1957 with my brother on the left. I'm next to him, and his two sons, my nephews Donnie and Wayne, are on the far right. The Dim, Donnie, and Wayne all threw no hitters, but I wasn't a pitcher, so I didn't throw a no hitter. But at one time, we were all playing on the same team in the late 50s. Little League baseball started in Freehold with the Farm Belt League. Now, most people aren't aware of that, but even if you're from Freehold, sometimes you're not aware of it, because the official Williamsport Baseball League started in 1951 in Freehold. But prior to that, the Holy Name groups in the English Town, Adelphia, Marlboro, and Freehold areas had a team which was called the Farm Belt League. And I was on the St. Rose team. The Adelphia was called the Blue Ball Bees, because that's what Adelphia was called in those days. And Marlboro actually played their games at the Marlboro State Hospital, which was an interesting group of spectators. But they produced, some good ball players. And then Little League came to Freehold in 51. Unlike other towns in Monmouth County, again, I'm relating, this is Freehold experience. This particular Freehold fellow, who used to go by Jimmy Leon in the old days, actually picked 6 no-hitters in Little League baseball. Then he went to West Virginia and pitched another no-hitter. Fantastic guy. So following the Merchants run, Dim created Freehold baseball team, the Freehold Townsmen. Now, the Freehold Townsmen was an operation for all things considered, a pretty long time, from 58 to 64. Numerous individuals played on this team, including myself. The team played good ball, never winning a championship and playing to some very sparse crowds. We were a well-respected ball club, and I remember great ball games during my playing days. Here's the photo of the 58 team with many players identified. The fellow on the far right, the African-American Sid Blacknall, actually passed away last week in Freehold. He came to Freehold late in 57. He joined this team, and he had pitched in the Negro League for many years. He pitched against Satchel Paige, and he was quite a ball player. He just passed away. This is a more current, or not more current, but 62 iteration of that same team, the Townsmen, and I'm on the far bottom left there. Real Townsmen were a successful team. We had some colorful games, if you want to use the word colorful. They were tough games, fought fiercely, etc. One of the final members to don a hat on the Freehold Townsmen team was Danny Lewis. Danny Lewis, a Freehold High School graduate, went on to play professional football with the Detroit Lions, and Dim recruited him to play on the Townsmen team just as the Townsmen were fading out. So Danny never really got to play, but it made good press at the time. So Dim continued to organize other teams in Freehold, including an Ed Carlton team, a team called the County Cedars. In July 1973, Freehold defeated Lincroft 11-9 with, quote, Dim belting a 2-run single to put Freehold in the lead. And this would be Dim's last time at bat, and it brings me to the end of the Freehold baseball history. Now, I will close by quoting a guy named Wordsworth here. And I think it aptly ends that what baseball meant to Freehold and to other places. I'll put a plug in for an excellent baseball exhibit in the Freehold Borough Hall that's in existence and will be there for several months. It is an exhibit featuring many of my articles and books on posters, and the basis for the exhibit is Glory Days in Freehold. Glory Days being one of the most popular songs by my cousin Bruce Springsteen. So it follows those lyrics and traces Bruce's history of baseball too, which is rather limited, but he did play ball. And it's a nice exhibit. If you do get to Freehold, it's free. Just go into Borough Hall, take a look at the posters. And there's an interesting QR code that you can access where 3 of us, Jimmy Leon, myself, and another individual named Joe Depew, are videoed, and it's about a 10-minute clip talking about who we think Glory Days was written about. If you've ever listened to that song, I immediately thought when I heard it, it was named after my brother Dim. Jimmy thought it was named after him. But Joe Depew, it was really named after him. And the story goes, you'll have to listen to the video and go to the exhibit to hear the true story, but it is quite an interesting story. So I do have books available tonight for sale. And if anybody on Zoom desires a book, kindly send in your information to Tom, I guess, and we'll be able to get one out to you. So thank you very much. And I hope it's been somewhat enjoyable. I'll be happy to take any questions if you do have any. Yes, Mark. Say again. Well, in the 40s or 50s, interesting because prior to that, if you recall, they were playing 50-game seasons. You know, when my uncle was managing the senior team in the turn of the century and for the early 20s. My recollection when I was playing, we'll call it the 50s, we probably had a 15 to 20 game season. That was a typical Jersey Shore league. Randy.
Authors know that one of the best ways of getting new information is to publish. So in the intervening months since the book came out, have you had people come up with substantive new information about Freehold baseball?
Well, yes and no. When I first made a presentation on this subject, it was at the Middletown County Historical Association in April of last year, before the book was published. And I got an awful lot of input at that time, which went into the book. Since I started this, I have had some people reinforce some of the information I have. I haven't had any new nuggets that I can incorporate. Yes, in the back. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, in the early days in this Freehold Institute world in the 1870s, they were young men going to boarding school at the Freehold Institute. But that quickly, by the 1870s, 80s, how old is a young man? The 1819 timeframe.